King John is usually remembered as England's worst king, greedy, cruel, cowardly, and forced by his own barons to seal Magna Carta. But if that label is all you know, you have only seen the final page of a much longer story. Because John made serious mistakes, but he also inherited a cracking empire, an empty purse, and an impossible expectation. He was not an innocent victim, and he was not only the bad king of legend. The real question is not whether John failed, but why his failure became England's most useful historical warning. To understand John, you have to begin with his place in the family. He was Henry II's youngest son, never meant to inherit very much. His nickname, Lackland, was not just a later insult. It came from the fact that his father initially left him with almost no land. From the beginning, John lived in the shadow of his brothers, especially Richard, the man later remembered as the Lionheart. In popular memory, Richard became the crusading hero, while John became the symbol of betrayal, jealousy, and failure. But that contrast already served the needs of storytelling. If one brother had to shine, the other fit neatly into the dark. Young John was not simply a weak bystander. He was intelligent, energetic, legally minded, and unusually alert to administration. The problem was that his intelligence often came with insecurity, suspicion, vindictiveness, and a dangerous kind of short-sightedness. In Henry II's final years, the royal family was like a castle, packed with gunpowder, with fathers, sons, and brothers fighting over power. John learned politics in that family, and what he learned was not trust. He learned that betrayal could be a tool. When Richard I became king and left for crusade, John remained in England, waiting for opportunity and creating trouble. Later legend loved to paint him as the little brother trying to steal the throne while the hero was away. During Richard's captivity, John did deal with Philip II of France and tried to improve his own political position. But the problem was not only ambition. Medieval royal politics rewarded competition until one claimant finally lost. John's ambition was real, but the system around him also encouraged royal relatives to test each other's weakness. Richard returned and forgave John, but the shadow remained. Many people now believed John might betray at the decisive moment. In 1199, Richard died and John finally became King of England, but his succession was not as secure as it looked. His strongest rival was his nephew Arthur, Duke of Brittany, a young claimant many nobles considered more legitimate. This succession dispute was not just a family quarrel, it was a structural crisis inside the Angevin Empire. John was King of England, but he also ruled vast French lands that legally involved the authority of the French king. In other words, he was a king in one system and almost a vassal being judged in another. Philip II saw the opportunity. He did not need John to be evil. He only needed John to be politically vulnerable. In the early years, John was not without ability. He moved quickly, understood administration, and could act decisively in war. But his greatest weakness was failing to convince powerful nobles that he would treat them fairly, steadily, and predictably. A medieval king could be harsh, greedy, even brutal, but he could not make his own followers feel unsafe. Arthur's fate made that problem irreversible. John captured him, and after that, Arthur disappeared from the historical record. We do not have enough evidence to reconstruct Arthur's death with certainty, but many contemporaries believe John was responsible. For John, this was not an ordinary scandal. It was a disaster of legitimacy. A king could defeat a rival, but it was much harder to escape the shadow of killing a young kinsman. Philip II used John's legal weakness and damaged reputation in France to take apart the Angevin lands piece by piece. In 1204, Normandy fell. It was one of the most decisive failures of John's entire reign. Normandy was not just another territory, it was the core of Norman identity, aristocratic networks, wealth, and cross-channel power. When Normandy was lost, many nobles had to choose between lands on both sides of the channel. Later memory often says John lost France, as if an incompetent king simply dropped a family possession. But the more accurate story is that he faced a patient French king who used law, pressure, and opportunity better than he did. Still, that does not excuse John. Other kings faced danger, but John's personality made the crisis worse. After losing Normandy, he did not accept the new reality. He turned England into a machine for funding reconquest. To raise money, he expanded fines, inheritance payments, scutage, and feudal revenues, pushing administration to its limits. In one sense, John was not a lazy bad king. His problem was that he exploited his kingdom with extraordinary energy. He understood accounts, legal loopholes, what nobles owed him, and how to turn royal rights into money. That made him more frightening than a careless tyrant. His oppression was not chaotic, it was recorded and systematic. For English nobles, the issue was not only heavy taxation, it was the fear that anyone might become his next target. If you offended him, a fine could become ruinous, an inheritance could be delayed, and a marriage could be treated as royal property. Kingship in his hands was not a distant symbol. It was a debt, a summons, or a humiliation arriving at the door. That is one reason his reputation became so dark. His enemies were nobles and churchmen who could preserve their resentment in writing. Then John collided with the church. The dispute over the Archbishop of Canterbury became a direct confrontation with Pope Innocent III. This was not only a religious dispute, it was a question of power. Who controlled the highest church office in England? John rejected Stephen Langton, the Pope's preferred candidate, and England was placed under interdict in 1208. In 1209, John himself was excommunicated, which in medieval society was far more than a diplomatic embarrassment. Church life was restricted, royal legitimacy was damaged, and John used vacant church positions as another source of income. Once again, he showed a cold administrative talent. What terrified others could also be turned into revenue. But the more he gained in the short term, the more isolated he became in the long term. By 1213, John submitted to the Pope and accepted England back as a papal fief. Politically, the move had logic because papal support helped him against rebellion and strengthened his position. But to many in England, it proved that John would trade the kingdom's dignity to preserve his own authority. At the same time, he was preparing one more effort to recover the lost continental lands. The Battle of Bouvines in 1214 became another turning point. John's allies were defeated, and his hopes of restoring the empire collapsed. For the English barons, this meant years of financial pressure had not produced victory, only more failure. A king could ask for sacrifice, but when sacrifice produced only defeat, obedience began turning into anger. In 1215, rebellion finally broke out. The barons were not modern democrats, they were angry feudal elites. They wanted to limit the king in order to protect their own rights, property, and legal standing. But history sometimes grows larger symbols out of narrow interests. At Runnymede, John was forced to accept Magna Carta. At first, it was not a sacred charter of liberty. It was a peace agreement meant to stop civil war, filled with practical feudal clauses and immediate political demands. Yet it also contained principles later generations would reinterpret. The king could not stand entirely above the law. John accepted it, but that did not mean he believed in those limits. Almost immediately, he sought papal support to annul Magna Carta, and conflict returned. England slid into the First Barons' War, and the crisis became larger than a quarrel over taxation. This is the great irony of John's reputation. He was forced to seal a document he did not want to obey. Yet, because of that document, his name became permanently attached to the history of liberty and legal restraint. In his final year, the situation grew increasingly chaotic. Rebel barons even invited Prince Louis of France to take the English throne. This was not a small revolt. It was a moment when the kingdom nearly turned toward a foreign ruler. John kept moving, taxing, punishing, and raising troops. Whatever else he was, he did not simply stop fighting. But his body and his political world were both collapsing. In 1216, he died at Newark, leaving behind a 9-year-old son, Henry III. After John's death, the political situation changed. The Regency government reissued Magna Carta to unite support around the child king. That revealed a brutal truth. Sometimes a failed king was more useful dead than alive. While John lived, Magna Carta was a weapon against him. After he died, it could become a banner for his son. Historical memory then began to reorganize itself. John became the model bad king, and Magna Carta became a founding myth of good law. Later literature strengthened the image even further, especially the Robin Hood tradition. In those stories, Richard was the absent rightful king, John was the greedy oppressor, and the forest outlaw defended the people. It was not careful history, but it was an extremely effective machine of memory. It turned finance, inheritance law, feudal obligations, and imperial collapse into a simple story everyone could understand. Bad King John bullied good people, and resistance became both exciting and morally satisfying. John fit that role because he gave later storytellers plenty to work with. He was not completely framed. His cruelty, suspicion, financial pressure, broken trust, and military failure were real. But calling him England's worst king can hide the more complicated facts. He was not incapable of government. In fact, he was a strong administrator, and royal records became more detailed under his rule. He was not without strategic awareness. He understood that losing continental lands would change the future of the Plantagenet dynasty. His tragedy was that he possessed the machinery of government but lacked the trust that made people accept it. A king could fail and survive if his subjects still believed he had honor, fairness, and predictable justice. After John failed, many believed something else, that he would retaliate, extort, betray promises, and weaponize the rules. That was where his kingship truly broke down. So King John's label was not a lie invented from nothing. It was a compressed truth. It magnified real faults, removed complicated background, hid structural pressures, and turned political failure into a moral fable. That is something history often does. It may not invent a monster, but it trims a complicated person into the shape of one. If we only ask whether John was a bad king, the answer is too easy. Yes, he was dangerous, harsh, and disastrous. But if we ask why he became the worst king, the story becomes much more interesting. His failure helped barons justify rebellion. Later generations explain liberty, literature create a villain, and England tell a story about law. He became a convenient container for fear of tyranny, desire for legal restraint, and warnings about failed monarchy. In the end, John was not misunderstood into a saint, and he was not demonized from nothing. What history misunderstood was the temptation to treat him as one simple answer. Normandy, the Church, Magna Carta, Civil War, and Robin Hood all pushed him toward the same label. The worst king sounds like a verdict, but it is really the result of a long historical memory. John failed, and he failed severely. But his greatest irony is this: the king who tried to rule without limits helped create the strongest symbol of limiting kings,